Sure enough, the Philippines is inconsistent in words and deeds. On the one hand, it has reached an agreement with China on the control of disputed waters in the South China Sea. On the other hand, it continues to challenge China's bottom line. Now the focus has shifted from Reneged to Shinbin Zhao. Philippine Defense Secretary Gilbert Teodoro, on the one hand, accuses China of being the destroyer of peace in the South China Sea. On the other hand, he claims to expand the interpretation of the U.S.-Philippines Mutual Defense Treaty to deal with a powerful and cunning opponent. The United States also cooperates. Admiral Samuel Pillaparo, commander of the Indo-Pacific Command, said on August 27 that it is a completely reasonable option for U.S. warships to escort Philippine ships on supply missions in the South China Sea. However, this requires discussions between the United States and the Philippines based on the U.S.-Philippines Mutual Defense Treaty. On August 29, Pillaparo shouted again that the U.S. military is ready and has a series of options. But Pillaparo refused to disclose the specific military action plan of the United States, claiming that this is to prevent potential opponents from being able to formulate countermeasures against these options. Philippine Chief of Staff General Romeo Brawner claimed that the United States has proposed to the Philippines to escort Philippine ships in disputed waters in the South China Sea, including joining or escorting Philippine ships to carry out rotation and supply missions. However, we will try all possible options and approaches. We can do it by ourselves and we will do our best. However, the Philippines still relies on the backing of the U.S. military. Brawner claimed, if all options are exhausted and still useless, then it is time to seek help. For example, when Philippine soldiers are without any supplies, hungry and even on the verge of death due to the blockade by the Chinese side, that is the time when we seek help from the United States. However, we still have many options. Interestingly, Brawner mentioned, this is not only about cooperating with the United States, but also working hand in hand with other like-minded countries. At the joint press conference on August 29, Pillaparo and Brawner also refused to disclose when the medium-range missile system deployed on Luzon Island in the north of the Philippines would be withdrawn. Brawner said that he thanked the U.S. military for transporting advanced weapons to the Philippines, and said that the Philippine military has begun to come into contact with advanced defensive weapons planned to be equipped in the future, just as we did with the Stinger missiles and Javelin missiles. Even though these weapons are not currently in our arsenal, we have already started training. On the surface, the United States and the Philippines seem to be working in unison. But what is the actual situation? At around 12 on August 31st, Philippine ship No. 9701, which was illegally staying at Shinbin Zhao in China, provoked trouble. It was on the port side of the Chinese Coast Guard ship 5205 and deliberately collided with the Chinese ship, resulting in a collision. Marcos Jr. came to power through a political alliance with the Duterte family. His biggest political challenge is to accelerate the development of the Philippine economy. Now the political alliance has broken down. Political stability has been disrupted, and the economic outlook is gloomy. The midterm elections are approaching. Marcos Jr. urgently needs to divert public attention and protect his political life. Hyping up issues in the South China Sea helps to mobilize national emotions and establish an image of bravely protecting the country. It also happens to coincide with the strategy in the U.S. Indo-Pacific strategy of containing China from the South China Sea direction. The problem is that Marcos Jr. has the intention to cause trouble in the South China Sea, but lacks the courage to confront China. He even lacks the resources to be a troublemaker. He dares to use the power of the United States to provoke China. But if provocation turns into a challenge and China responds, it will be a disaster for the Philippines. China's strength is an unbearable burden for the Philippines. if the United States participates in the conflict. A conflict between China and the United States is like a battle between gods. No matter who wins, the Philippines in the middle will definitely be reduced to ashes. There is no lack of pro-American and anti-Chinese sentiment among the Philippine people. However, in the prospect of their homes and relatives being destroyed, not taking sides is also a consensus among the people. Marcos Jr. is clear about this. So playing with fire cannot go too far. This is part of the reason why the Philippines politely refuses the participation of the U.S. Navy in escort missions. The U.S. Navy may not be willing to really escort either and accidentally start a war. This is another reason, which will be discussed later. The Philippines is also not confident in the United States' determination to safeguard Philippine interests even at the expense of its own interests. The U.S.-Philippines Mutual Defense Treaty was signed in 1951 and it has been 73 years. If someone directly bombs Manila, the treaty may be invoked. But no one can be sure whether the United States will go all out with China for the South China Sea, islands and reefs that disappear at high tide. Historically, after the Vietnam War, the United States withdrew from Southeast Asia and abandoned wartime allies like the Philippines and Thailand like worn-out shoes. This was originally the original intention of the establishment of ASEAN. Gather together for self-protection and never take sides. The Philippines is not forgetful in the South China Sea disputes. The Philippines sometimes attempts to pull ASEAN to stand on its side, but it always fails. Recently, the Philippines has pulled in Vietnam and tried to bypass ASEAN, taking advantage of the fact that Vietnam also has disputes with China over the South China Sea. It is trying to directly create a small anti-China clique in the South China Sea. Vietnamese Defense Minister Phan Van Giang visited the Philippines on August 30th. He held talks with Teodoro in Manila and signed a letter of intent to strengthen cooperation in disaster relief and military medicine. Teodoro then stated that the two countries plan to sign a defense cooperation agreement before the end of 2024. The meeting between the two came at a time when the situation in the South China Sea continues to heat up. Teodoro said at a joint press conference, "We face common threats. We will work together to deal with these threats in the spirit of ASEAN unity." However, he did not explicitly mention China. Vietnam attaches importance to defense cooperation with the Philippines and agrees to maintain peace and stability in the South China Sea and resolve disputes peacefully in accordance with international law. The Philippines and Vietnam also intend to conduct joint patrols in the South China Sea from Vietnam's perspective. Maintaining peace and stability in the South China Sea is in Vietnam's interests, and maintaining friendly relations with China is even more in Vietnam's interests. After taking office, Vietnamese new leader Su Lin's first destination for an overseas visit was China, connecting Vietnam's Northern Railway with China. At the same time, in a literal and symbolic sense, it further highlights that Vietnam is seeking lasting peace, friendship and common prosperity with China. Vietnam and China have been conducting joint patrols in the Beibu Gulf for many years, and joint patrols on the land border are also in full swing. Vietnam will protect its interests in the South China Sea, but has no intention of standing up for the Philippines. The Philippines is also in cahoots with Japan and Australia. Japan needs the Philippines to contain China in the South China Sea direction and disperse the pressure in the Taiwan Strait and East China Sea directions. Australia regards the South China Sea as a buffer zone with China. Coordinated actions with the United States also require Japan and Australia to do something in the South China Sea. But whether it is Japan or Australia, they both only have second-rate national strength and military power. Encouraging the Philippines to take risks in a dangerous situation is one thing, but directly getting involved is another thing. It is neither in line with the national interests of Japan and Australia nor does it have the necessary military strength. Interestingly, it is the United States. Speaking of which, Supporting the Philippines to challenge China is in the interest of the United States. Pia Paro has made statements many times. But the U.S. Department of Defense, the State Department and the White House neither support Papa Ro's statement nor deny it. Pia Paro can swear. But the interpretation of the U.S.-Philippines Mutual Defense Treaty should be made by the U.S. State Department. Even the appearance of the Department of Defense is more authoritative. Ultimately, it is the responsibility of the White House, not the commander of the Indo-Pacific Command. In terms of authorization, the Indo-Pacific Command can only order immediate counterattacks and self-defense when the U.S. military in the region is directly attacked. Any coordinated combat invoking a mutual defense treaty requires approval from the White House. This is a political decision, not a military decision, and not something that the Indo-Pacific Command has the final say on. Papa Ro's clamor contrasts with the silence of the State Department, the Department of Defense, and the White House. This leaves a lot of room for imagination. The United States is still the only superpower in the world, with the most powerful military force and political influence. Maintaining Pax Americana is the core interest of the United States. The United States needs to suppress the rise of China, but the rise of China is essentially economic, not military. The economic base determines the superstructure, and the economic base also determines military strength. The rise in political influence and military strength led by the growth of the economic base is sustainable and cannot be suppressed. If the United States could still start a war with China and win, it would have long ago provoked trouble. Inciting Taiwan independence and instigating Japan to cause trouble over the Diaoyu Islands are all fuses that can ignite a war with China. There is no need to find the Philippines as another fuse. From a military perspective, the Philippines is not the best battlefield for the United States. Taiwan Island is also separated from the mainland by the sea. The undercurrent of Taiwan independence has been surging all the time. But the superiority of the People's Liberation Army has expanded from the Taiwan Strait to the Western Pacific. It is increasingly becoming an impossible task for the U.S. military to come to the rescue of Taiwan. Japan is also an island country. There are already U.S. troops stationed there, and it also has considerable military strength on its own. But Japan is also within the firing range of the People's Liberation Army and has no interest in getting involved. Australia is still reluctant to give up its role as the deputy sheriff of Asia-Pacific for Europe and the United States. But it is really too far away and its military strength is also insufficient. The Philippines is an island country, not too far and not too close to China. In history, the Philippines was a colony of the United States. In reality, it has an inextricably complicated relationship with the United States. There is both a strong pro-American force and an equally strong anti-American force among the people. More importantly, with the rise of China, China is gradually having an influence on an equal footing with that of the United States in the Philippines. China's strength also makes the Philippine public think twice. They must safeguard interests in the South China Sea while avoiding conflicts with China. The Philippines also legally stipulates that there shall be no foreign troops stationed. Therefore, the military facilities opened by Marcos Jr. to the U.S. military are not easily turned into U.S. military bases because it is impossible to station troops all year round and stockpile weapons and ammunition. If the United States really invokes the U.S.-Philippines Mutual Defense Treaty, it is a matter of rushing to provide assistance rather than local defense. The United States is separated from the Philippines by the Pacific Ocean, and China is separated from the Philippines by the Bashi Strait. At that time, it will be a competition to see who is faster, more fierce, more accurate. In this Philippines exercise in April 2024, the U.S. military deployed a new medium-range missile system on Luzon Island in the north of the Philippines, and it still did not withdraw for a long time after the exercise. China has repeatedly opposed and condemned this U.S. military deployment in the Philippines, and said it will undermine regional stability, according to Reuters. Anonymous U.S. officials claimed that whether to deploy missiles in the Philippines on a long-term basis will partly depend on China's actions. This is definitely blackmail. But it doesn't have much effect. The U.S. military has deployed a battalion of Typhoon missiles. This is an advanced weapon system that can launch Tomahawk cruise missiles and Standard 6 land attack missiles after Aegis on land is mobilized. It is said to be advanced because this was a gap in U.S. military equipment before. It has been newly developed and successfully deployed. It is not leading in concept and capability. The U.S. military has just begun to be equipped with a small amount. However, it is probably a long way off before the Philippine military is equipped. The Tomahawk missile is an old acquaintance. In the Gulf War era more than 30 years ago, this was a long-arm strike artifact. More than 30 years later, low altitude and high subsonic penetration is no longer reliable. The limited stealth shaping of the latest Tomahawk Block V cannot change this reality. Typhoon is a transitional weapon system for the U.S. Army before a real hypersonic missile takes shape. However, the U.S. Army's hypersonic missile is still at the technical level of a double cone, and the Waver-eyed or hypersonic missile is still unknown when it will be available. China is just too big. 10 or 8 battalions can't make big waves. Importantly, even if the Philippine law prohibiting foreign troops from being stationed can be bypassed, there are insurmountable escalation problems with the permanent stationing of Typhoon on Luzon Island. Unprotected Typhoon is very vulnerable under the attacks of Chinese drones, missiles and even special forces. Air defense and security increase the exposure of the U.S. troops stationed in the Philippines and require fighter jets and large-scale troop protection. Americans have good memories. The Vietnam War escalated step by step like this and became uncontrollable. This is also the return to the Philippines. The U.S. military does not have such troops, and the Philippines does not have such political preparations. The biggest problem is that if there is really a fight, the flames of war may not be limited to the Philippines. If China and the United States engage in armed conflict, it is very difficult for Taiwan independence not to take the opportunity to become public, rapidly expanding the flames of war to the Taiwan Strait. This may lead to a chain reaction on the Korean peninsula and induce a full-scale conflict between North and South Korea to solve the peninsula issue once and for all. It is very difficult for the U.S. troops stationed in Japan not to get involved. It is very difficult for North Korea's long-range firepower not to expand the flames of war to Japan. The strong intervention of the U.S. troops stationed in South Korea and Japan on the peninsula may not fail to cause counter-intervention by China and Russia. This is another reason for the flames of war to expand to Japan on the other side of the world. If the conflict in Ukraine is still in a stalemate, the great chaos in the world in the Asia-Pacific may lead to the complication of the European conflict. Belarus, the 3 Baltic states, Poland, and Kaliningrad may all be involved in some kind of conflict when the United States is too busy to take care of it. Hamas, Hezbollah, Syria, and Iran in the Middle East may all attack archenemy Israel. This is a full-fledged world war. This makes the United States want both in the South China Sea. It wants to support the Philippines in provoking China, but also wants to avoid leading to a real war. So Piaparo can make high-profile noises, but the White House can only play dumb at the military level. It is also a matter of consideration for the U.S. Navy to decide whether to carry out escort or supply missions. The simplest way is for the U.S. Navy to directly dispatch supplies and use helicopters for vertical supply, bypassing China's Coast Guard line. This is something the U.S. Navy can easily do, but it also rushes in front of the Philippines and directly heads for a war with China. As mentioned earlier, this does not conform to the United States' desire for both nor does it conform to the principle of the Philippines playing with fire, but not burning itself. When Bronner said that the United States proposed that U.S. warships escort or even supply while the Philippines politely refuse. It is hard to say whether the United States and the Philippines are playing a duet and trying to use an empty city strategy to pressure China. Another way is for the Philippine Navy to dispatch warships, and the U.S. Navy to dispatch warships to escort. If the Philippines only dispatches Coast Guard ships, it is difficult for U.S. warships to escort. Coast Guard ships are law enforcement ships, and there is no problem of escort. When the police are dispatched, there is no problem of military escort, but if the Philippine Navy is dispatched, it is determined to raise the conflict level and head straight for war. Then the South China Sea Fleet will definitely upgrade equally. And it doesn't mean that if you dispatch a 500-ton dilapidated ship, China will not dispatch a 13,000-ton giant ship. In fact, the Type 055 is already in the South China Sea. There is another way that the Philippine Coast Guard ship is dispatched and the U.S. Coast Guard escorts. But that is only a joint dispatch and not really an escort. The bigger problem is that the U.S. Coast Guard has no law enforcement power in the South China Sea. And there is no justifiable reason for both the United States and the Philippines to act. When the Philippine police are cracking down on crime and drugs, there is no support from the U.S. National Guard technically. If the U.S. Navy wants to dispatch for escort, only the Arleigh Burke class can be sent. Coincidentally, the Type 055 is even larger than the Arleigh Burke class. And a large number of good brothers have been eager to take action on the periphery for a long time. Píaparo may call for the entry of U.S. aircraft carriers to help out, but it will be of no avail. The South China Sea is the home field of the Chinese Navy. And there is also support from the Air Force and the Rocket Force, having an advantage in troops and firepower. Now it is long past the era of the 1996 Taiwan Strait crisis. The United States may not be able to deploy more than 2 aircraft carrier battle groups to the South China Sea in time. The most important thing is, this is not an escort. This is an indirect declaration of war. Is the United States ready? If it were ready, it wouldn't have waited until now. Wouldn't it be great to nip China's rise in the bud? Why wait until the Great Wall of Steel and steel wings are all pressing down? American public opinion will not support starting World War III for a reef that cannot be seen. Even at high tide, Píaparo may already have a series of options. But if there is a killer option, now is the time to announce it to deter China. To make the opponent back down knowing the difficulty. The opponent needs to see the killer weapon in one's own hand. Strategic ambiguity also requires a sufficient amount of publicity. For example, the strategic ambiguity of the United States in the Taiwan Strait is not a general series of options, but rather not making a clear and binding commitment to large-scale intervention by the U.S. military. Papa Ross' series of options is more like a confusing array. A confusing array is not strategic ambiguity, but an empty city strategy. China need not be moved by the verbal provocations of the United States and the Philippines. Keep doing what should be done. On the other hand, it is really necessary to make Chinese Coast Guard ships larger and more high performance. Traditionally, Coast Guard ships do not need warship-level performance. Seaworthiness, endurance, and multi-purpose are more important. Firepower does not need to be very strong, but it needs to be able to carry law enforcement and rescue equipment such as helicopters and rigid-hulled inflatable boats. In recent years, China has built some Coast Guard ships based on the Type 054A. It is reported that a larger new type of Coast Guard ship based on the Type 052D is being built. It can be imagined that if the new type of Coast Guard ship based on the Type 052D is in the South China Sea now, there will be no problem in deterring the Philippines. And it will not be afraid to confront the Arleigh Burke class. Coast Guard ships are not for fighting warships, but they need to have the ability to play bumper ships. The new type of Coast Guard ship based on the Type 05-D is close to the Arleigh Burke class in tonnage. If the structure is strengthened considering it as a bumper ship, it will be even less at a disadvantage. The cancelled armaments save weight, which can just be used to strengthen the hull if U.S. warships attempt to play bumper ships. They will not gain an advantage if they dare to open fire. The Type 055 and the Chinese Navy on the sidelines will rush forward. The Type 055 is by far the largest destroyer of the Chinese Navy. If a Coast Guard ship based on the Type 055 is also on the scene, there is even less to fear. At present, although China already has a 10,000-ton Coast Guard ship, it is estimated that it is insufficient in terms of speed. After all, it is designed according to civilian ship standards. Once the Arleigh Burke class accelerates and races, it may be left behind. In the new situation, new equipment is needed. A new concept Coast Guard ship with large tonnage, high speed, strong hull, and low armament, specially used for confronting foreign navies and making it difficult for the other side to act easily. Marcos Jr. is striving for his political career, and so is the Duterte family. Political turmoil in the Philippines will continue, but actions to protect national interests will continue. Peace and development are China's basic national policies, but this is also carried out under the major premise of safeguarding national interests. The confrontation in the South China Sea will be a protracted war and a war of attrition. In the end, it is a competition of resources, determination and endurance. China is rising. Time is on China's side. Resources and endurance are also on China's side. China's determination is stronger than ever. But this competition of China is not to defeat the Philippines, but to force the Philippines to understand that taking the path of peace and development together with China is the right choice.